Hey everybody, I feel like I'm in Captain Kangaroo or something, or Mr. Rogers. I would love to be in Mr. Rogers' place. That was ideal. We're in the nursery or the cry room, depending on how you look at it. This is the place on the side of the sanctuary with the big windows where children and parents can come if they are noisy or whatever and feel like they don't want to be in service, they can come in here, still hear the service, still see the service, still participate, and yet there's opportunity for kids to do what kids do. And so I thought this was a good setting, since in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is talking about children in the sense of their humility, their lowliness of status, their lowliness in the place of man, but in their perfect place, in the place of God. And I'm not going to get into, whether children have innocence or any of that. I'm not going to go there. That's not what we're talking about today. That's for another discussion. Today, Jesus uses a child as an example of humility. And it's something very difficult for us grown-ups to come to grips with, the idea of humility. We don't enjoy it. We don't enjoy being humble and all of that. So Jesus brings a child into the midst of them and starts talking about it. So we're going to read Matthew 18. We're going to start at verse 1. We're going to read a little bit, probably through verse 6. And then we're going to skip down to verse 10. So we're going to kind of take a little bit of Matthew 18 in pieces. But beginning at verse 1, so Matthew 18, verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck, to be drowned in the depth of the sea. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." That's Matthew 18, starting at verse 1, and then going through a little bit of chapter 18. So Jesus is with his disciples, and they've been traveling. He's been talking about his upcoming trip to Jerusalem now that they've gone through the mountain of transfiguration and all of that. And so his disciples are beginning to wonder, what place are they going to have in Jesus' new kingdom? What is their position going to be? Who's going to be his right hand? Who's going to be his left hand? Who's going to be these great positions? And everybody, I think, most of them are probably thinking that Peter's going to have a particular place because he's the one who's always kind of speaking up on behalf of everybody. Maybe John might have a place of honor, or James. We don't know. So they ask, who's the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest, or who is the greatest? And Jesus, knowing that their question comes probably out of selfish concern, out of ambition, out of wondering who Jesus saw as the best disciple, who was the head of the class, and not a little bit of pride in their question that they're wondering who the greatest is. And Jesus, never missing a chance to sort of knock them down a peg, brings a child into their midst. So imagine that Jesus and the disciples and the, people are gathered around and everybody's kind of doing their thing, and he's not specifically teaching in the sense of, he's not up on the side of the mountain teaching about something in particular. And so there's children nearby, which I just love that image of children playing in the midst of the disciples with Jesus around, and the disciples, you could see them, getting grumpy, that these kids are around, and, they're getting in the way and they're underfoot, but Jesus is like, they're kids. They're just doing what kids do. I'm projecting, of course. He doesn't actually say that, but I'm projecting, maybe because that's what I would say, but that's neither here nor there, because Jesus brings one of the children into their midst, and he has this child, and he says to his disciples, who are all concerned about who's going to be the greatest, that unless they they turn from what they're doing, the way that they're thinking, that pridefulness and that looking for the next step up, unless they turn from that way of thinking and see themselves in the humble estate or the lowly condition of children or a child, they'll never get there. He says, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. You will always be on the outside. You won't get it. So Jesus has this child in front of them who, by all accounts, children in first century, Palestine and first century Jerusalem, or first century, the ancient Near East, where they would be. Children didn't have a whole lot of value in and of themselves. They were valuable in what potential they could bring, in what potential they had. Would they take over the family business? Did they have the potential to become rabbis or teachers or fishermen? What was their potential? That's the value that children had, and mostly male children. Female children didn't have even much potential at all in and of themselves. They could become mothers and child bearers, basically. And so there's a lot of stuff that you can read about how children were thought of at the time. They weren't really thought of at the time. So Jesus says, unless you turn from these prideful ways and become like this child is now, not like this child will one day become, not like this child will soon be, not like this child has particular potential, like this child is now. Like how you regard this child now. Humble, lowly, not because he wants to be, not because he's trying to be, but because that's his position. He's humble and lowly. And Jesus says this is who enters the kingdom of God. Not children in the sense of age, but in the sense of humility. He goes on to say that whoever receives a child or someone in this state, in this humility, in this humbleness, receives me, he says. But then he warns that if anybody messes with these little ones, these humble ones in faith, those who are of lowly estate, then if you cause one of those to sin, if there's something you do that pushes them to do something or that lures them or leads them to do something, he says it's better for you to be drowned in the depths of the sea. And not just drown, he says have a millstone tied around your neck, a big hunk of stone that was used for grinding wheat tied around your neck, and you have no chance of survival. He says this is how important the lowly and the meek are in Jesus' kingdom. And yes, this is how important children are in Jesus' kingdom. Children of all ages, from those who have yet to see the light of day outside their mother's womb to children who are 40-something years old children, those of humble and lowly estate, those who are not thought of, those who are forgotten, those who are brushed aside until they might amount to anything. So Jesus says, my Father in heaven doesn't want to see any of these little ones perish. He doesn't want to see any of them led astray. He doesn't want to see any of them hurt. He doesn't want to see his little ones his young ones, his humble ones, his lowly ones hurt. So Jesus isn't talking about children necessarily in age again. He's talking about those who see themselves as outside of being thought of. That's a weird way to say it. So why is this a struggle? Why can't we just say, oh yeah, we'll be humble and that'll be fine? You end up singing that song, Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. And I don't know whose copyright that is, but we have a hard time with humility. We don't like to be humble. And some of us are uncomfortable with compliments, which is, I don't think, necessarily the same thing as not wanting to be humble or struggling with humility. We like to be well thought of. We like to be liked. We like people thinking well of us. And it's not bad when people think well of us. It's when we go seeking that. It's when we go looking for that position, when we go looking to be considered of some estate. That's where we run into problems. It's where we get this ambitiousness, this ambition to become something that people are going to respect and people are going to recognize and people are going to love and admire. And we don't have any good examples. Even those examples of humility, we've kind of raised them up to heroic status. If we think about, when people think of humility, those heroes of humility, we think of like Mother Teresa, right? The lepers and sick ones in Calcutta, and so we take this nun who wanted nothing more than to serve and help the lowly, and we've sort of elevated her to this shining example of humility, and it sort of defeats the purpose. The other we often think of is Mahatma Gandhi, and we think of his humility and his passive peaceful resistance and those kinds of things, and then we take his status as somebody who is humble and we elevate it so that he's heroically humble. None of that makes sense, but we do that. We do that all the time. We do that with all sorts of people. So even when we're trying to be humble or to show somebody who's humble, we kind of wreck it. Or we could go the other way and not even worry about it, and then we get people that put themselves out there as the greatest of all time, as the best at everything, as the one who knows the most about everything, and we put ourselves out there as the be-all, end-all of human existence, that we are the best of the best, and we praise and we admire and we strive for, and we put all of these people up on pedestals and give them wonderful awards and trophies and all sorts of stuff. And we don't know how to handle humility. Humility is hard. In the Christian faith, it's hard to be humble. And we struggle with that because it's sort of one of those things that's on a knife edge between being totally self-deprecating and really trying to ruin the image of ourselves. And on the other side is pride and trying to elevate ourselves. And humility is this thin line that we walk. This thin line that guides us. But Jesus uses this child as an example of humility for his disciples who couldn't put themselves in that place. The disciples who thought they were pretty good stuff. And so we see Jesus taking the ones who are forgotten, brushed aside, not thought of, and not elevating them to heroic status, but really attempting to grab the ones who are up on their high horses and pull them down. And maybe that's what's so hard about humility, because it hurts. It hurts to be pulled down from a high horse. It hurts to be put in one's place. It's a sacrifice to be humble. It's a sacrifice to think of others more than you think of yourself, to think more highly of others than you think of yourself. It's hard because then we see, well, Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Well, if I'm putting myself down in order that, then that doesn't make sense. But if we see the other as somebody who is worthy of serving, if we see the other as somebody who is worthy of us, not worthy of us serving them, that's a weird thing to say, but higher than us, then we see Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Then we see Jesus placing his hands and blessing the children. Then we see Jesus talking to the woman at the well. Then we see Jesus dying on the cross for us prideful human beings. We see Jesus taking the punishment of a common criminal, a low-life criminal, if we could be prideful in that. That Jesus takes the form of that criminal on the cross, endures the punishment and the shame and the mocking and the abuse and torture. He does that. And he's God in the flesh, remember. Remember, we said that last week about love. He is God in the flesh. He is the creator of the universe embodied in Jesus Christ, and yet he goes to death on the cross for us. He humbles himself by taking on the form of a servant and going to death on a cross for us. So yeah, humility hurts. Humbling, being humbled, taking on that form of a servant hurts. But that's what we can expect in this life, in this part of life. As one who serves, it's going to hurt. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take being uncomfortable. It's going to take encountering people you'd rather not encounter. It's going to take getting to know people you'd rather not get to know. It's going to take getting to know the other, those people, those people we see that automatically we feel superior to. Humility is going to take getting pulled down off your high horse. But thanks be to God that Jesus did it first. That Jesus hit the ground after being pulled down from the cross, buried in a tomb. You can't get a whole lot lower than that. Descending into hell, we say in the Apostles' Creed, you can't get any lower than that. And yet he's the one who did it for us. So while us serving and being humbled, it's going to be a challenge, we have somebody who did it before us, who did it for us. That's Jesus. So here's the thing. Here's what I want to challenge you with this week, or whenever you're hearing this. When you see somebody, when you encounter somebody who you have this gut instinct to say, that's the other. I'm not gonna put myself in a position, to encounter that person. Now, yes, be safe. I'm not saying be reckless, don't be dangerous, don't go out looking for trouble. It's really easy to find. Don't go looking for it. But in your day-to-day, as you're serving, as you're living, as you're doing the things that you do, even though we're doing it even more limited, you still encounter people. And sometimes they come right to you. Sometimes they're other places. But think first, not what would Jesus do, because we're not Jesus. What would I as a Christian do? What would I as a humble servant of my neighbor do? What do they need? Is it something I can provide? Do they simply need something to drink, something to eat? Most of the people who would be watching this or listening to this, I think we can reasonably help. And if it's tight, if it's difficult, then the go-to is prayer. That's the one thing that doesn't cost us anything. The other thing that doesn't cost us anything is a kind word, a helpful thought, a smile. There are simple things. There are simple things you can do. And one of the other things, this goes beyond the sermon. So first, let me close this. Let me close up the sermon. So we find Jesus with the lowliest of people, loving and serving and giving. And he calls us through the Holy Spirit, through his word, empowers us by his grace and his love and his forgiveness to do likewise, to go in love, to go and serve. And so that's what we do. Amen. Now, if you're done